long time ago, my grandfather, Harry John Score, fired up my imagination and instilled in me a deep love for history with countless stories of his past. Now, I am a grandfather with stories of my own to share with my granddaughter, Hannah. Oh, and now, with the help of the World Wide Web, I can share them with you. Simple little tales of life from years and years ago. Farm kids and ponds go together like kids' shoes and mud. And my farm kid shoes were always muddy because out behind the barn, I had the mother of all ponds to play in. It was big, covered about 2 acres, but it was pretty safe in one way. During the wettest of years, the deepest spot was barely 3 feet. The rest of it wouldn't get your knees wet. However, since the cows shared it as a watering hole, it was muddy and thoroughly mixed with cow waste material. I'm sure you know what that is. Why I didn't die from some horrible disease before my teenage years is a mystery, and maybe a miracle. Anyway, in spite of the mud, the cow poo, snapping turtles, snakes, I hate snakes, and God knows what debilitating diseases lurked in those murky waters, whatever didn't kill me, well, you know. Back in the days when the Mills family had the farm, they bottled their own milk and sold it. So back then, the main purpose of the pond was to provide ice to keep the milk cool. It was a lot smaller then, just 100-foot square. Probably a lot deeper too, but when our cows got in it almost every day, caving in its banks, it didn't take long to silt in and shallow up. On about the late 50s, my father got another one of his money-making ideas. One dry summer, he got in there with a bucket loader, opened up one corner of the pond, pushed, scraped, dug, and pretty much tripled it in size. On the west side of the pond was a strip of slightly higher, hard ground that our 50s-era Farmall Super M tractor didn't have the gumption to gouge out. Instead, the old man stuck to working the lower and softer ground and dug around the harder stuff, creating a peninsula in the middle of the now enlarged body of muck. The whole thing roughly took the shape of a giant horseshoe, hence the name it was given. Now, everything he pushed, scraped, and dug, he piled up in a huge mound on the end of the peninsula. That mound consisted of some of the nicest fertile topsoil one could find in the town of Montgomery. He figured he could get some good money out of that. Also, with this greatly enlarged body of water, he had a plan to stock it with bait fish, and there was good money in bait fish. Well, none of that money-making stuff mattered much to me, a preteen farm kid with an overactive imagination and a kid in a toy store attitude towards life. To me, that 10-foot mound of topsoil was the Rock of Gibraltar jutting out into the opening of the Mediterranean, and that enlarged pond was the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic, and the Pacific, and all the great rivers of the world. Within a few weeks, I had a fleet of sailing ships. Maritime engineering marvels they were, built out of boards from a grandfather's scrap pile. I would cut one end into a point for a bow, attached a scrap of tin beneath the stern for a rudder, nailed narrow strips of wood on top for masts, used scraps of bed sheets for sails. Spring, summer, and fall, my fleet was constantly at sea. Every time the wind changed, they set sail to a different port. My scrapwood navy circumnavigated the globe, discovered new worlds, and fought major sea battles, all by the time I was 10 years old. And then I got a rowboat. Don't remember who got it or where it came from. It wasn't the most seaworthy thing, just a cheap-built, flat-bottomed skiff made out of thin plywood. However, to me, it was as grand as the Titanic, and I didn't have to worry about icebergs. Better yet, if the ship went down, at worst, it was just a short, waist-deep, muddy walk to shore. Just about every weekend and almost every afternoon, after work, of course, I'd be out in my watery world, rowing my heart out and leading my fleet on endless adventures. It wasn't long before my imagination got the better of me, when a couple of old broom handles and a feed bag ended up becoming a mast and a sail. It worked all right, but without an extended keel and a lack of space, even in 2 acres of water, tacking into the wind was pretty much impossible. I still had to row back. But then I got a better idea. It was either the fall of '61 or spring of '62. I was sitting in 6th grade reading class, reading a short story about Robert Fulton. Remember him? He was the guy who developed the first practical steamboat back in 1807. Turns out, according to this story I was reading, when he was a kid like me, he got the idea of putting paddle wheels on a rowboat. Well, what the hell? I hauled a skiff out of the pond, loaded it on a trailer, towed it up to my grandfather's garage, the Score Farm shop, and went to work. Everything I needed was there. Plenty of boards for paddle wheels, pipe cutter, pipe threader, and all the galvanized water pipe I needed to fashion a crank mechanism to turn the paddles. Every spare moment for the next few days were spent refitting my fleet's flagship to mechanical propulsion. By the weekend, I was ready to launch. Of course, I couldn't have a bottle of champagne for the occasion, but an empty milk carton refilled with pond water sufficed. That Robert Fulton was a genius. It worked great. I paddled back and forth across that pond in all directions faster than the strongest wind could push me, faster than I could ever work the oars. Finally, I was master of the muddy waters for about a week. Several feet of water pipe burst in the barn. My grandfather couldn't figure out where most of his supply of replacement pipe went. Turned out it went into my new super-duper paddle wheel propulsion system. Yeah, I had to give it back. Well, as Geoffrey Chaucer prophetically penned over 600 years ago, all good things must come to an end. Right after my magical high seas adventure that year, and after the water pipe incident, that part of the Wallkill River Valley went into a drought of several years. The Horseshoe Pond pretty much shrunk back into its original small square of the Mills family era. Of course, as nature and time would have it, I went from over-imaginative preteen to over-preoccupied teenager. Work, high school, driver's license, and girls replaced my high seas adventures. It wasn't until the late 70s and early 80s when some wetter years brought back the pond and at least some of its former glory. That's when a few of the next generation discovered its magic. It was actually my niece, nephew, my 2 children, and some of the new kids in the neighborhood that the name Horseshoe Pond originated from. In my time, it was simply named the Big Pond. By the 90s, it dried up again. This time, so much so, it grew up in weeds and turned into nothing more than a wet swale. Its magical legacy all but forgotten. But, once more, thanks to twisted fate, the pond came back to life. Rosedale Nurseries took over the farm, and my old pal Paul Hankey and I had it dredged out, opening up the springs that fed it. The original square is now about 10 feet deep and serves as an irrigation pond. Finally, I am happy to tell you, just a tiny little bit of magic remains in those enchanted waters. In 2008, my 4-year-old granddaughter came up to visit. I built one more scrap wood sailing ship just for her. It had the tried and true pointed bow, tin rudder, and bedsheet sails. Together, we launched it, and together we watched the last voyage across the magical, mystical Big Horseshoe Pond. Oh yes, that too is now years and years ago.